Yes, so welcome back. I'm delighted to be joined by Jack Hazlewood, who is a pro-democracy activist and writer who focuses a lot on the issues around Hong Kong. He used to work for a pro-democracy political party in Hong Kong. Jack, first of all, thank you very much for your time.
You
And
know.
obviously, there are very major developments happening in Hong Kong, most notably being the new security law.
Mhm.
I mean, in your view, does that completely end the kind of the one country, two systems agreement that China came to with the UK and Hong Kong?
Yeah, I think it does completely shatter any sort of semblance of meaningful autonomy that we were promised under one country, two systems. I mean, we've witnessed pretty much since President Xi came to power in 2012, just the very sort of steady, initially steady and rapidly sort of increasing pace of what might be called sort of incidents of major interference in Hong Kong affairs from Beijing. I mean, it does the basic law, which is Hong Kong's constitution, does provide for Beijing to interfere, sort of what might be described as within the spirit of one country, two systems. It does have reserved powers, etc. But the pace at which they've come, I mean, you can look prior to sort of 2010, 2011, you could count on sort of one hand the number of these sort of cases. So in 2003, the proposed national security laws, which were immediately scrapped after a massive public backlash. And incidentally, at the time, Tony Blair, obviously the Prime Minister of the UK, he claimed that the fact that plans had been ditched was evidence that one country, two systems was working just as it should. So, you know, Beijing proposed something and, you know, Hong Kong people didn't agree with it and the plans were dropped. But ever since, you know, Xi Jinping has come to power, we've just seen an absolute litany of things. I mean, it would probably be in excess of sort of 50 now of sort of these incidents where the mark has been completely, you know, not just overstepped but sort of, you know, trounced all over. And now, after, you know, what has been a year of just, you know, total turmoil, whichever way you look at it, we've now just, you know, the final act of if you like, you know, just completely shredding all of the agreements and pledges which were made in terms of, you know, the governing principles for Hong Kong after the handover and stuff have just been completely and utterly trampled all over.
Yeah. And presumably when these new laws come into place, a lot of kind of Hong Kong pro-democracy activists could be in quite a lot of trouble, as you know, facing lengthy jail sentences and that kind of thing. I mean, kind of how worried are people in Hong Kong, are activists in Hong Kong?
Well, there's just a lot of I think uncertainty is the real thing, and a real sort of cloud of uncertainty hanging over everyone's heads, because firstly, we have no idea what the precise wording of the laws are going to be. It's still not been unveiled as of, you know, us speaking right now. So there's uncertainty in that sense. There's also a huge amount of uncertainty because a huge amount is going to depend on the judicial interpretation of the laws as well, because the concepts that are described in Article 23 of the Basic Law, which is basically an article which says that the Hong Kong government should enact laws which basically prevent things including treason, sedition, etc., against, quote, the central people's government, which means the Beijing authorities, the central government in Beijing. But though we know that they will pertain to those things, we have no idea how these are going to be defined. And also, and the judicial interpretation is really important because basically, in Hong Kong, though our legal system is still, generally speaking, even despite the last few years, it's still highly respected, certainly across Asia, relative to most parts of Asia. When it comes to constitutional affairs, the power of interpretation or the final interpretation does not rest in a court in Hong Kong. It actually rests in the National People's Congress Standing Committee in Beijing, which basically means that, as in if they want to, the interpretation of these laws when they come in can just be changed at any time with a click of a finger from, you know, the top table of the Politburo. So it's extremely worrying because it basically just creates an avenue for them to do that virtually, not literally overnight, but extremely quickly and without warning. And if they were to do that, you could literally, so there's, I mean, just to give you an example, a slogan that has been chanted in Hong Kong, literally going back to sort of to the Tiananmen Square massacre, literally translates into English as "end one-party dictatorship." Now, under these laws, in theory, it is possible that literally shouting that could become, you know, treason or sedition, because it literally, that is the words of Article 23 are, you know, should enact laws to combat treason and sedition against the central people's government. And if you're calling for an end to one-party dictatorship, that could easily be interpreted as that. So that could be something which lands you a lengthy prison sentence in theory. But of course, like it's not going to, it's highly unlikely to affect ordinary people, as it were. But in terms of politicians and activists, I mean, certainly it's inevitable that people will be caught up. And they're not introducing this for its own sake. There will be people who will be, charged under it, and they will be the high-profile pro-democracy activists and politicians, basically.
It was interesting that you mentioned Tiananmen Square. So obviously that was a few days ago, was the anniversary of that. And as always happens in Hong Kong, there was a big kind of gathering to commemorate that. But as far as I'm aware, this was the first time it was technically illegal, although it still went ahead. That's exactly the kind of thing that will be clamped down on under these new laws.
So it's important to state as well that obviously the laws aren't in force yet. They haven't been enacted. But also the reason for it being banned, it was because of the gathering ban that's currently in place because of the pandemic. You're not still in Hong Kong. You're not allowed any gatherings of more than 8 people. And that's just ended. So it ended on June 5th, that provision. I'm not entirely sure what's now in place, actually. I need to double check. But on June 4th, which is the date of the Tiananmen anniversary, it was still in effect. So that was the cover for them denying the letter of no objection, which is what you need for permission for a protest in Hong Kong. But no, I think it is pretty obvious that next year they are going to deny permission for the vigil, which is just a completely ludicrous, thing, because it's entirely peaceful. It's, the idea that it could be viewed as somehow a threat to national security. I mean, it's literally, tens of thousands of people holding candles. I mean, in no way, shape or form can it be viewed as anything other than a peaceful memorial event, which it is. But no, it's exactly the kind of thing that people fear, because it's an entirely peaceful protest. It's very civilized. It's very, it's very Hong Kong in a way, in terms of it. It's not something which is viewed as controversial. Certainly, there is some controversy surrounding it for complicated reasons I won't go into, but it's not controversial in terms of the method of protest. It's just people holding candles, etc. So it's exactly the kind of thing that people fear, that now these laws are coming into effect. It's the kind of thing that Beijing is just not going to tolerate anymore. I'm just extremely sad, obviously.
I mean, obviously, there's a lot of pro-democracy activists who I presume you've kind of come across and worked with. A lot of them are very young, so people like Joshua Wong, incredibly brave. And presumably, if these laws went through and they continue their activity, they could be facing quite hefty prison sentences. Would that be in mainland China or in Hong Kong itself?
No, the detention would be in Hong Kong.
Okay.
But I mean, in future, maybe a decade down the line, that could change. I mean, we just don't know. I mean, trying to predict what's going to be happening in 10 years in Hong Kong is just an absolute mug's game, really. But, it would be detention in Hong Kong, essentially, in a prison facility. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, the UK is suggesting it could offer some kind of sanctuary to British national overseas passport holders. So that's basically people born before 1997. However, it still seems slightly unclear to me. I don't know about you, whether it applies to anyone before 1997 who has the right to apply to one, or just people who already have a passport or could renew the passport. Because obviously, in the second category, we're about 3.5 million people, whereas the first one is 400,000. I mean, do you know, was the government still trying to make its mind up on that?
So the Foreign Office issued a clarification after the initial announcement by Raab, where they basically said that currently there are 300 and something thousand B&O passport holders. So they are people who have renewed their British national overseas citizenship, their passport time after time. But there are still 2.9 million B&O citizens. The reason why the number is so much lower is essentially because if you are a Hong Kong permanent resident, you're automatically entitled to Chinese citizenship as well as as B&O citizenship if you were born prior to 97, and you needed to register prior to the handover date as well. But a B&O passport to renew, I think it is the same cost as a UK passport. It's about 90 quid for the cheapest option. However, an SAR passport, which is the Chinese version issued by the Chinese government, is only about £30. So it's a lot cheaper, and it doesn't actually provide you with any less benefit, which is why that number is so much lower, because there's no real material benefit to people getting the B&O passport when you save yourself £60 every 5 or 10 years whenever you renew it. But no, the Foreign Office clarification made clear that it does apply to all 2.9 million or so British national overseas in Hong Kong. And the only thing I would say on the announcement is, in itself, even though it does provide a path to citizenship, as Dominic Raab set out, firstly, it's not going to lead to an exodus in itself that people are sort of maybe thinking it might, because it's still quite restrictive. You've got to remember, not all of these 2.9 million people have good enough English skills to be able to get a job in the UK, even if they might have really good experience, whether it's with a uni degree or not. The likelihood of you being able to get good employment in the UK, without being able to speak English is one thing. Also, no guarantee of good employment, even if you do have, good enough experience, etc. But primarily, it's because even though it's a path to citizenship, it's still, there's still real uncertainty. You need to reapply for it each year and stuff. It's not just like an open door. But the significance is basically in the fact that the UK government has now finally moved on the B&O issue, and further concessions down the line are totally inevitable. Now it's started. I mean, whether it will end in everyone getting a full, upgraded to full British citizenship or not is uncertain. It's certainly on the table, but it's not, it's not current government policy. But previously, the UK government's position was that expanding B&O rights would be a violation of the Joint Declaration. That was because of legal advice written by Lord Goldsmith, who recently came out and basically said that his words had been totally misinterpreted, and actually, no, it would not be violating the Joint Declaration at all, because it was just used as a cop-out by the Foreign Office to say, oh, we can't expand B&O rights because it would be violating the Joint Declaration. But now that that's basically been debunked for the myth it is, they have moved now on the B&O issue, and I have no doubt at all that whether it's in 6 months or a year or 18 months or whenever, they will make further concessions on B&O rights. It's just completely inevitable now they've moved on it, and now we've established it doesn't violate the Joint Declaration. It's inevitable they make further concessions. So that's where the significance is in, basically. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, that just doesn't apply to anyone born after 1997, which will cover a lot of the young protesters we've seen kind of so bravely over the last year.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, should the British government be doing more for them, offering them some kind of pathway as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So it looks like Taiwan is really going to step up to the plate on this. President Tsai has basically, I actually sort of over the last few weeks, the noises made by the Canadian government as well. I think, I don't know exactly what the division of labour of it will be, but I think it's pretty clear that we are moving rapidly in the direction of basically a situation where everyone who wants to leave Hong Kong for overseas is going to be able to. There can't be complacency on that, but it's going to be a situation where that takes place. But I would sort of just caution that whilst it's a fantastic move and something I would fully support, I think that the governments of the free world have to sort of also step up to the plate on China more generally, because whilst giving everyone in Hong Kong the right to leave if they want to, or if things deteriorate further, etc., is fantastic, and something that not just should happen, but something that I think the Western world has a moral responsibility to do. It also needs to be, it can't be seen as the end of the road. I mean, the UK government in particular, I think, really has to hold the Chinese government's feet to the fire on, one country, two systems, and every, all other agreements, etc., going forward, and in human rights in China in general, because you can't just sort of leave, it's like, oh yeah, okay, we'll welcome Hong Kong and stuff, but it can't be seen as the end. It's got to be something which is ongoing, and which because I mean, even if everyone is given virtually free free virtual freedom to leave Hong Kong, not everyone's going to leave for obvious reasons. It's people's home. I mean, trying to estimate the number is a really difficult thing to do as well, because if someone might want to leave from the sort of political perspective and feel like unsafe or what have you. But if they've got a good job in Hong Kong and no guarantee of a good job in, whether it's UK, Australia, Taiwan, or wherever, you're not likely to want to, make that leap of, leaving behind everything in Hong Kong and with no guarantee of future, good prospects with regards to your livelihood. So I think it's sort of, this talk of like a mass exodus and stuff. It's a lot of these things is up in the air at the moment. We just don't know, essentially. But I think a lot of people are going to leave. But I think going forward, the UK government can't just sort of see this as like, this is the final chapter with regards to the UK government's responsibilities in Hong Kong. We'll give everyone a British passport. We'll give the people who want a British passport, and that's it. No, it's got to be something which continues, which is ongoing, and yeah, they've just got to move, very much in the direction of just saying we will no longer tolerate, this kind of behaviour from Beijing, basically.
Yeah. Now, obviously, the Trump administration has suggested it could revoke Hong Kong's special trading status, and basically just treat it like another part of China.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, presumably, if that goes through, and if you combine it with some level of exodus, would that just kind of kill Hong Kong as one of the world's great trading cities?
I don't think it would kill it, but it's going to have a severe economic impact. I don't think there's any sort of doubt about that, really, because you can look at there's actually quite a range of estimates with regard to the benefit that status brings Hong Kong in terms of the additional business, particularly financial services, etc., that it brings to the city. But it just depends largely as well on how companies will respond to it, because you have this sort of gradual process of them looking to move their sort of Asia operations overseas. And I'm not an economist or anything, but there's a lot of sort of very delicate calculations being made in boardrooms, etc., about do they basically want to sort of turn their Hong Kong operation into a virtual skeleton operation and move over to Singapore or even to a city in the mainland potentially. And it's just very difficult to know what kind of the trend will be on that, because some companies have done it already, but it's just in terms of Hong Kong's economic future, I think it's really difficult to say that a total sort of collapse, etc., is possible, certainly, but it's far from inevitable. I think it is possible that sort of Hong Kong's economy can sort of it's certainly not going to go from strength to strength. I don't think anyone's pretending that, but can Hong Kong remain as an international financial centre? Well, I mean, it depends on the response of the financial institutions, etc., to be honest. But it's not a foregone conclusion yet, but it certainly is a move that if as the administration looks like they are almost certainly going to revoke the special status they afford to Hong Kong, it would certainly be deeply damaging to Hong Kong's economy. I don't think anyone would seek to deny that, really.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, China seems to be heading in a much more authoritarian direction under the leadership of Xi Jinping. I mean, why do you think that is? Why is it kind of, because obviously there was a period where it was kind of slightly liberalizing, from kind of the origins of Mao, and now it seems to be going in a more authoritarian direction again. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, there's all sorts of theories, really, but clearly I think Xi Jinping regards Western, or he regards sort of these sort of more liberal values and sort of democratizing notions of democratizing China, etc., as being essentially these sort of Western plots to destabilize the regime and China as a whole. And I think to what extent is it an extent to just personally consolidate his power versus something that he genuinely believes is going to lead to a stronger nation? I mean, this stuff is open to interpretation and argument, really. But the general trends towards a China that compared to sort of 8 years ago is rapidly resembling in terms of the saber rattling that you hear from the foreign ministry, the kind of things that you'd be used to hearing from North Korea. I mean, it really is sort of not in an economic sense, obviously, but it really is heading into a far more authoritarian era, and that will have consequences, because I don't think anyone can pretend that a state as large as China, with so many different ethnic minorities, with a huge class of migrant laborers, a potentially dissatisfied middle class, all these sort of pressures, etc. You can't just sort of beat people into line and stuff. I think in the long term, this is something which is going to seriously destabilize the Communist Party's grip on power. The problem, I would say, is I think that's decades away. I don't think it's something that's going to be felt anytime soon, even with clouds potentially appearing over the Chinese economy and things. But there's not going to be an imminent attempt to overthrow the government in China. The Communist Party's grip on power is pretty much as secure as it's ever been. So whilst I'd say the long-term prospects for them, keeping power are diminishing, and maybe at the end of our lifetimes, they might not be in power. It's certainly not something they're facing an imminent threat from. It's a long-term problem as opposed to something that's short-term.
I mean, obviously, one of the, I guess, kind of the biggest ongoing human rights abuses in the world is the treatment of Uyghur Muslims and other Muslim minorities from China's west. So, I mean, there were reports of, up to 1 million in essentially re-education camps. There've been leaks from those camps talking about, gross human rights abuses, torture. I think Xi Jinping, there was a leak which said where he said, show them no mercy, essentially. But it kind of seems a bit, it obviously is a massive issue. It hasn't really cut through in the West. I mean, if you ask kind of the random, the average man in the street, what do you think about the Uyghurs? They have no idea what you're talking about. I mean, why do you think it is that this issue's got so little attention?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of reasons. Firstly, nobody really knows who the Uyghurs are as an ethnicity in the West. I mean, I mean, I'll freely admit I had no idea who the Uyghur people were until a couple of years ago. And I'm relatively young, etc. But like, I'd still, I'm guessing it's the same for you as well. Like maybe prior to like two years ago or so, it's probably something you never knew it was an ethnicity that existed. The economic importance or lack thereof of East Turkestan or Xinjiang is sort of another reason as well. And people can also sort of say that race has something to do with it as well, because it's not, these people are not seen as being sort of contributors to anything valuable. Certainly in China as well. I mean, the popular view of Uyghurs nowadays is just they're terrorists, basically. I mean, that's the lot, and that's absolutely a Chinese government. It's been something they've absolutely been trying to foment amongst the ethnic Chinese population in China, which is this view of Uyghurs as essentially, people that are sort of what's the word, like almost like polluted by these sort of by Islamism and other kind of extremist ideologies, and they've been very successful in that as well. They had, you can read reports and stuff of how, and I've got loads of friends who've spent time in Xinjiang, and the way how they're basically just held not just in contempt but with suspicion everywhere in China. Like, so if you're ethnically Uyghur, or even if you've got on your Chinese ID card that your residency is in Xinjiang, like you'll have real problems trying to check into like a hotel and stuff, because you can expect the police to be called and they'll like interview you and stuff. And this is if you're ethnically Chinese, so it's just the everyday life for Uyghur people. And to be fair as well, we should make something clear. What's going on is cultural genocide. There's no two ways about it. Amnesty International in particular has been absolutely brilliant in terms of the reports they've going on, and it is it's a form of genocide. There can be no credible denial of that anymore. The evidence is not just overwhelming; it's totally incontrovertible of what the Chinese government is doing in East Turkestan or Xinjiang, however you want to refer to it. But as to why it's not been taken up in the West, I mean, I think there's a litany of reasons, but I would focus less on the why and actually just say that it's something which should be probably the premier human rights issue that we should be talking about in the world, because it's a humanitarian catastrophe what is going on, and time is running out as well. I mean, the camps as well are largely actually being scaled back because they've essentially done their job of they're known as re-education camps, etc. There's been significant releases and closing down these camps because they've essentially managed to succeed in their mission of essentially it's not about sort of brainwashing necessarily, or that's certainly something they're attempting to do, but people who've been detained, etc. in Xinjiang, they basically, from the perspective of the authorities, these people are not going to be troublemakers anymore, because they know just how high the price is if they get involved with anything that could be perceived as anti-government. They'll just, they will just be detained for an indefinite period of time, and you don't know when you're going to be released. You don't know when you're going to see your family again. So these people are have just been terrified into submission essentially, and it's like I say, it should be the premier human rights issue that we should all be talking about in the world today, and it just isn't. And it is an absolute travesty that's not the case, because what's happening is a genocide, and it's just atrocious.
I mean, one thing that slightly surprised me is that more Muslim countries aren't speaking out. I know there's big economic factors and kind of the Belt and Road Initiative and so on.
Yeah.
But I mean, not just the fact they're not speaking out. So I can't remember exactly when, but I think the UK organised a letter at the UN Security Council, and China organised a counter letter. And quite a lot of Muslim countries signed the counter letter, basically saying, it's all fine. I mean, is that purely kind of economic submission? I mean, is that kind of a sign of things we should be worried about going forward? Kind of certain developing countries feeling they have to toe the Chinese line more and more.
Yeah, I'm definitely not the person to ask about this, but there's been a lot written about it, and it's just an incredible phenomenon how, particularly Pakistan, which is
Yeah,
one of China's, I mean, if not the closest partner that China has in the world, because China doesn't really have any allies to any intents and purposes. I mean, there's no, China does not have anyone that if they joined in a war that would send troops to fight alongside China, a war of aggression. I mean, they're just, it just isn't something that would happen. There is no reliable ally that China possesses in the world, but the closest thing that China has to it is probably Pakistan. And just when you consider as well, obviously the fact that the majority of Uyghurs are Muslim, and it's a huge factor because obviously China is the Communist Party it's a completely atheist organization. You're not allowed actually to have a religious belief and be a member of the Communist Party. You're expected to be an atheist, and just that fact that Muslims across China are persecuted regardless of ethnicity. It is extraordinary that Muslim nations haven't spoken out, the vast majority of them, in a significant way, and it's partly economic, etc. But I think it might be born out of a sort of pragmatism that they recognise the country's leaders, because I don't think anyone can fail to know the truth now. I mean, it's way beyond the cover-up stage. I mean, this is something that is way out in the open in terms of, especially like the political elites of these countries. They know what's going on. I think it might be a sort of pragmatism of they know they can't do anything about it. Like words of condemnation from those countries are not going to make China turn around and stop, and close the camps, etc., and stop this cultural genocide. But at the same time, they're not prepared to take the step of saying, well, unless you end this practice in Xinjiang, then we're prepared to basically, sever our economic ties with you, which they're just not going to do. They can't, in many cases, they can't afford to do that. Particularly Pakistan is, a country which is extremely economic dependent on China now. And so, I think they're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. But at the same time, their abdication of responsibility when it comes to the Uyghur people is just an absolute. It's disgusting and it's a disgrace. Because they should be, leading the condemnation on the international stage about it, and they're just not.
I mean, do you think China's system now offers a kind of coherent ideological challenge to the Western liberal democratic model in the same way that the USSR did? So, in the sense, in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, if you wanted to develop and modernise your country, you kind of generally went down the liberal democratic route, at least to some extent, and there's huge pressure on you to do so by all the international organisations. Do you think it's now the case where we're in almost a second Cold War? There's a kind of coherent ideological rival from a kind of authoritarian state nationalism, I guess a kind of more statist form of capitalism. And is there a risk that other countries might start following that model, might see what China's done and think, yeah, we'll have that here, please?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, yeah, absolutely, we are heading towards a sort of second Cold War. But I would say, whilst China does represent an ideological, clash, well, not what's the word? So, like you say, it poses an ideological challenge to the Western order. I certainly wouldn't describe it as coherent because the Communist Party doesn't have in any way, shape, or form a coherent ideology. The Chinese economic model is another question. That's certainly something that's more coherent, a sort of model of state capitalism, etc. And it's something they've tried to export around the world, particularly in sort of East Africa and places. But I think the thing is that with talk of a sort of a new Cold War, the thing you've got to remember is the USSR had obviously this network of satellite states in Eastern Europe and elsewhere as well, which China is just not going to have, in any kind of new. There's a fundamental distinction in that because, as I say, China does not have a single country which could fit the definition of an ally. If you say it just doesn't have a single nation which, again, in a war of aggression, if China was fighting somewhere in the world, they wouldn't be joined by a single nation. There wouldn't be anyone who would fight alongside them. So there's a fundamental distinction there. But that being said, I think that on an economic level, as the Chinese economic model of state capitals, etc., certainly it is something which China is, I think, open to exporting. Though I think countries, again, it's because of the fact obviously it's still there's a huge amount of fact it's not necessarily market based, but it's certainly got a huge market element. So it's not. It's not a sort of hardline state socialism by any stretch of the imagination or anything like that. So the extent to which it is distinct from Western capitalism is kind of limited anyway. But in terms of cliche phrase, whatever, clash of civilizations and a new Cold War. Yeah, I think we most definitely are heading down that road. I don't, and Hong Kong is, again, it's another cliche calling it, the new West Berlin, but I think it is accurate in the sense that it's the place where, the sort of the two things, these two sort of forces are just sort of meeting and fighting it out. And whatever view you might have on the future of Hong Kong or anything like that, I think that's certainly something which is now basically just becoming our reality, really, for better or worse.
Yeah. I mean, so kind of obviously we talk about Cold War. I guess China has a couple of border disputes which have potential to get worse than that. So I'm thinking in particular with India, where I believe in the last few weeks they moved troops into what India regards as its territory and have now kind of fortified themselves. And obviously in the South China Sea. I mean, do you think there's a serious risk of a kind of miscalculation by one side or the other, leading to a hot war, either between China and India or between China and one of its rivals, most likely the United States, in the South China Sea?
I don't personally think that's the case, but I mean, I suppose the risk of miscalculation is always there, but I don't necessarily think it's any higher than 10 years ago, to be honest, in terms of a hot war, because it would be, probably the end of the world as we know it. I mean, in all seriousness, though, it's so, and the risks in terms of nuclear annihilation, I don't think there's necessarily changed from the last sort of decade or two in terms of like nuclear stockpiles or anything like that. And no one's seriously going to, or no one in this dispute is ever going to seriously threaten nuclear war. But I don't think the risks of a hot war have necessarily gone up at all. But there might be sort of the possibility of a proxy war of some kind in Southeast Asia or somewhere in the world being played out is, I guess, possible with sort of shifting geopolitics, but it's not going to be something where, as I say, in the Cold War, there were regular sort of flashpoints and wars being fought all over sort of Central America and across the Middle East as well, and across the world. But I don't think there's any risk of any kind of armed conflict being sparked by it. But I mean, it's certainly possible, I guess, but I don't think it's likely.
I mean, just one final question. I mean, you've mentioned several times that China doesn't have many allies.
Yeah.
I mean, does that mean the key for Western powers to constraining China is via some kind of international coalition? So, in the sense that most of China's neighbours it has border disputes with, I think it has disputes with about 6 of its neighbours over the South China Sea alone. Is the best bet for Western powers then to try and form a kind of a wider alliance with other Asian powers to try and contain China?
Well, I mean, yes, in short, but I think the extent to which there's already something like that in place is kind of something that's worth mentioning. There's a really interesting film called The Coming War on China by a guy called John Pilger, who the premise of the film, etc., is it's a really interesting watch. I mean, I'd recommend it to people just from an academic perspective. But there's a really interesting graphic that he shows about how US naval bases in East Asia, etc., and he describes them as, and there's a map that's shown up on the screen, and he describes them as essentially a noose that is formed around China. So it starts up in Japan, and then it comes down through Taiwan, and through all these places in Southeast Asia. And you can sort of see from Beijing's perspective that this is something which it's not even so much a noose around China, but it's certainly something which is a constraint on China's ambitions. And the South China Sea has been exploited because it's somewhere where there isn't that kind of presence, in which Beijing has been able to stake out extremely expansionist territorial claim, not without condemnation or without controversy, but it's been able to, when I say credibly, it's been able to make it and sort of incorporate it into its foreign policy in a coherent way and make it a central focal point in that, and even got support from some countries for that claim as well. But I don't necessarily sort of think that there's all that talk of like Boris setting up this alliance of democracies like dissent. I don't think it's a bad initiative, but I think the idea that necessarily it's going to act as a brake on China's ambitions or be able to sort of halt them in any way that's not going to happen. It might improve the coherency of a Western response to that, so it might be a good thing in that respect, but I don't think it can be said that it would be something which could actually combat that and would actually lead to China becoming or China adopting a sort of less aggressive foreign policy. I don't think that will happen, but it may well improve the coherency of the Western response to that. So, it might well be a good idea, but I certainly don't think it would change China's behaviour.
Yeah. Well, so on Jack, on that note, it's been really interesting. So I'm very grateful for your time.